This is the story of a secret meeting at Camp David in the middle of August 1971, actually 50 years ago this August, when President Nixon and his top advisors went into a meeting to make a momentous decision. And that decision was to sever the link between the dollar and gold. At that moment, and actually since 1944, $35 could buy 1 ounce of gold. And that link created a level of stability around the world that fueled the recovery of Japan and Germany from the war, and that created enormous prosperity in the US for over 2 decades. The reason they had to sever the link is that, there's several reasons actually. One was that the currencies of Japan and Germany, 2 countries which were becoming very strong, were much too cheap. They were really undervalued, which meant the dollar was overvalued. And the only way the US could think of to devalue the dollar was basically to get rid of the link to gold. A second reason why they had to do this is with an overvalued dollar, suddenly a trade deficit began to appear, the first in the 20th century. And so there was an enormous concern about American competitiveness. And the other side of that was a growth of protectionism, really major outbursts of protectionism in Congress. So in order to deal with these 2 problems, the US had to delink from gold. But there was a third issue which was even bigger. And that is that the world economy had grown so fast and it had become so big, and the need for dollars was so great that the US printed many more dollars than they could back by gold. And so by 1971, the pledge that an ounce of gold was worth $35 was really void. They couldn't actually make it happen. So for all these reasons, they decided to cut the link. And they did it. They did it in secret. They announced it at the end of the weekend, and it created enormous turbulence in the global economy and enormous political strains among the allies. And anyway, I tell this story in really through the characters. And at the end, I come to grips with the implications that this decision has had for the global economy ever since. I've written several books on very broad themes, and I have always been attracted to the possibility of taking a single event and using it to illustrate some very major topics, but to focus intensely on the event itself. And this is the first time I did that, but I found it very gratifying because you can go very, very deep into something that has bounds, but at the same time, you really try to think through what are the implications of this sort of case study. That's why I was familiar with this particular decision because I had been in the government not long after it had been taken. And I also knew a lot of people who were actually at Camp David. And fortunately, I had a chance to interview them. Unfortunately, they were all quite elderly, and none of them has survived since the time that I actually met with them. But I was able to capture their memories in the book. When the dollar was delinked from gold, the world really changed in terms of the way it saw money. Before that, money was kind of a stable concept because if you held dollars, if you held any currency, you could change it into dollars. And if you held dollars, you could change it into gold. But once the link between the dollar and gold disappeared, the value of currencies was really an assessment of the credibility of a country's policies and the integrity of its financial institutions, such as its central banks and its treasuries. And so we unleashed an era of floating exchange rates, which had two major effects. The first is it created a world economy that was much more unstable, in which the values of currencies went up and down in substantial amounts. And we entered an era which became a kind of financial casino, because as currencies moved up and down, there was a chance to make money by speculating on currencies. That led to a whole industry of financial engineering. And so all of the things we see today, derivatives and derivatives of derivatives, the fear of global banking crises, all of that really derives from the disconnect between currencies and something that is very tangible. But on the other hand, we made globalization much more possible because we reduced the odds of protectionism, since currencies took the hit rather than economies. And so we allowed for a much larger and faster flow of capital and a much greater volume of trade. And I would argue that on balance, this really helped the world. I wrote this book through several characters. And what fascinated me the most really was the tension between the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, John Connally, who was a strident nationalist and whose motto was, "Let's screw the foreigners before they screw us." And he really didn't care at all about what the impact would be on other countries. He was just focused on the US. On the other hand, there were two characters who opposed him. One was Paul Volcker, whose name is obviously very familiar. He was just a young fellow at the time, but he argued very strenuously for a world that was much more cooperative. And he was backed up by Henry Kissinger, also just a new foreign policy advisor to Nixon, who argued that the importance of our alliances were every bit as important as the nature of the economic ties. And so there was this tension, I would say, between retrenchment and engagement, which of course has been a tension that we have seen ever since, and we see a lot of it today. Well, I go into the making of economic policy in considerable detail. And what I show is that Nixon had around him some of the best minds that we have ever had in government. There was Paul Volcker. There was a fellow named Arthur Burns, who was head of the Federal Reserve. There was George Shultz. Nobody knew who he was. He was at the beginning of his career, but he became one of the great statesmen of the 20th century. And there was Pete Peterson, who was a businessman, but really a very far-reaching thinker. And the government had done some very in-depth studies of the global monetary system and what kind of impact changes could have. But in the event, they got it wrong. It's not that they didn't make the right decision, it's that they really couldn't anticipate all the rockiness that would take place. And they thought there would be exchange rates that move up and down a little bit, but they never thought we would live with a world of floating exchange rates. And so the lesson I take is, no matter how smart a group of people is around the table, and no matter how much studying they do, when you're dealing with the global economy, you're really dealing with an enormous number of uncertainties, and there's nothing you can do about that other than to be very vigilant and very resilient and very, very observant of the trends and try to get ahead of them. But the notion that somehow you can anticipate what is going to happen, I take away from this that's not that will never be the case. What surprised me the most was all the parallels that exist between August 1971 and August 2021. At that time, there was a growing trade deficit and a real fear about how the United States was going to compete in the world. At that time, there was a feeling that other countries, particularly Japan and Germany, but really the European, the new, what they called the economic community at the time, which is the EU today, that they and Japan were not doing enough to hold up the world economy. At that time, there was a fear that Japan in particular had an economic system that was very different from ours and that was going to cause enormous problems. And at that time also, there was a feeling that the US had to focus more on building its society at home, and that the wars, the Vietnam War had gone on too long and really had become a terrible, not only a tragedy, but an enormous distraction. And so when I look at the situation today, I see the trade deficit. I see the constant pounding on our allies to do more. I see the focus on rebuilding the economy at home. And there's one other thing which I didn't mention, which I should have, was that in 1971, there was also the beginning of an inflationary period. And that made people nervous about holding the dollar. That was a threat to the dollar. And the rise of the German currency, the Deutschmark, was also a kind of threat to the dollar. And when I look at today, I say, you know, the dollar has remained very strong. It's still at the center of the global financial system. But substitute China for Japan, look at the inflation, and look at some of the possibilities for cryptocurrencies, particularly central bank digital currencies. And you have to ask a question, is the dollar going to come under enormous pressure again? So I didn't start out thinking there were parallels between these two periods. I just wanted to capture one period for all that it was worth. But when I was done, I said, oh my, I think that a lot of things have either come full circle or maybe they never changed.